We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and I'm a partnerships manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I'm very excited to welcome our guest, David Ryan Barcega Castro-Harris, and he's the founder of Amplify RJ. David, how you doing today?
Today, feeling kind of tired. Yesterday I went to a wedding for the first time in
Wow!
in over, before all of this, right? So feeling a little bit tired, but happy to be here.
Amazing. Well, I'm happy for you. I'm looking forward to going to like upcoming weddings as well. If you could tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, including your pronouns, and maybe something else that has recently brought you joy.
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is David Ryan Barcega Castro-Harris, all five names for the ancestors. I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. But I use he, him pronouns. My friends, Rebecca and Vic, shout out. They had planned to get married, last year and had to have those plans canceled. And so most presently, just them being able to start their life together in this official way. Was exciting and getting to connect with people who I haven't seen in a really long time. It was a 60-person wedding, which is the most people that I've been around,
Oh my
like other
gosh.
than like in a store in a long time. So like as much as there was like joy and happiness, there was some anxiety too. But fingers crossed, we're all okay.
Oh my gosh, stimulation overload. I am picturing it and I'm just like, I do have a little bit of anxiety, but also a lot of excitedness around being around people again and really connecting and celebrating a beautiful relationship as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know that when we spoke, we talked a little bit about Amplify RJ and how it really was born out of social, and there was a need for this kind of content. But can you tell us a little bit more about why you started the organization?
Yeah, so I said I would share why it's important for me to introduce myself with all five names, and I'll do that right now. Amplify RJ is a project that teaches restorative justice philosophy, practices, values through a lens of anti-racism, abolition, and decolonization, right? So for me, this work is about getting justice for my ancestors, right? The Filipino ancestors who were twice colonized, right, by the Spanish and then the United States. And my grandfather came here with our family in the late 1970s, right? My father's family, that's my maternal grandmother, my father's family are descendants of people who were enslaved and brought here from West Africa before any of us can remember, right? The name Harris comes from people who probably enslaved members of my family, my ancestors, right? So this work is also about getting justice for them, right? The Castro pieces from my wife, we both hyphenated our names, and she's from her family's from El Salvador, right? And the imperialism of Spanish, the U.S. influence, right, has caused so much harm. And so restorative justice to me is about getting justice, right, righting wrongs because of colonization and imperialism and systemic racism, forced assimilation. But it's also about building a better world for future generations. So when I think about restorative justice, it is about like repairing harm, but also proactively building and maintaining relationships to prevent future harm by leaning on values of interconnection, right? All of our ancestors, no matter where you're at in the world, have these ideas baked into our culture, right? From my ancestry, I think about words like Ubuntu, right? Where it is like, I am another, oh, sorry, a person is a person through another person, or I am because you are. Or in Tagalog, the word kapwa is this idea of like shared brotherhood, but in Babayan, which is a pre-colonial language of the Philippines, it's this idea of, shared interconnection between all beings. And the Mayans has the phrase in Lakech, Alakien, which is like, I am another you, you are another me. Or the Lakota have the phrase like Mitakuyasin, like we are all relatives, right? And so when we think about the world in those views, right, it is, of course, when we're experiencing conflict, of course, we're not going to throw people away. Of course, we're not going to alienate them. We're going to try to get back into good relationship because they are a part of us. They're a reflection of us. We belong to each other. And so Amplify RJ then is a project to explain to people on a mass level, like, this is what restorative justice is. This is how it applies to your life. This is how you can learn more and be supported in your journey through that work.
Yeah, and that's amazing. It sounds like it's a really personal work for you, and you're obviously really passionate and enthusiastic about it, and also sharing and educating others as well about restorative justice. I reviewed your website, and I know you have like a 40-minute video around defining what restorative
Yeah.
justice is as well, and also just post around how you go from diversity and inclusion, which are common words that corporate America uses as well to try to create an equitable workplace, to restorative justice. And I know that you in that video talked a lot about kind of language and how it is really important to be super intentional. For example, for restorative language versus punitive language. Can you talk a
Yeah.
little bit more about that for folks who might not be aware?
Yeah. So when I think about the major differences between a punitive and restorative approach, with a punitive approach, you're fundamentally asking three questions, right? What rule is broken? Who did it? And how can you punish them? And with a restorative approach, it's more like what happened, who was impacted, and how. And then how can we meet those needs that were caused by those impacts in order to make things as right as possible, right? And so you're coming to problems with a totally different frame of mind, and you're thinking about the people not as a victim or offender, right, or perpetrator, excuse me. You're thinking about people as a person, right, who caused harm, or a person who has been harmed, but also acknowledging that those labels don't necessarily fit in every situation, right? When harm is going both ways, you're also thinking about how can we work collaboratively instead of pitting people against each other. How can we work towards you know building relationships and trying, instead of trying to just control people's behavior to get certain outcomes? And so like those are major differences between those two approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that definitely that makes sense. And it's also a paradigm shift from what I think society is used to as well. So it needs a lot of kind of education around being super intentional. I know kind of in our first conversation, you talked about working with organizations and really schools. I think one of your workshops is like decolonizing the classroom, which I
Mhm.
love as well. And we talked a little bit about an opportunity to really engage with diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging folks at private sector companies to really practice restorative justice in an authentic way. What are your thoughts around? I know also that a lot of companies have tried to lean into anti-racism work, and do internal work as well, which I think is important to restorative justice. But how do you think about really the opportunity of organizations to lean into RJ?
Yeah. When I think about the words diversity and inclusion, well, one, this is not my original thought. I heard it from Resma Menakem, but I'm also sure that he's not the first person who said this. When we think about the words diversity and inclusion, we have to think about like diverse from what and included into what. When we're talking about diverse from what, it's diverse from dominant culture, right? White, cisgender, male, probably Protestant or Protestant work ethic values, right? And all these things, and those things don't just show up as far as like the people who are represented in the organization. It's baked into the culture. Tema Okun wrote this article called "The Characteristics of White Supremacy Culture in Organizations," and what she talks about there is the way that whiteness, not talking about white supremacy or white dominance as like the use of racial slurs or marching with the Klan, but it's about the way that whiteness is upheld as the standard, the norm, and everything else is less than, right? So things have to be one certain way. People uh, follow the written word just to the letter because the policy was written like this. This is how we're going to do it, right? Not considering the multiple truths or different experiences that other people have. It's also about, being defensive, and when people are bringing up conflict or challenges, trying to avoid conflict, trying to make sure that power is concentrated with the people who continue to have power. It's about valuing productivity over the people involved, right? And so when we're trying to bring people from quote unquote diverse backgrounds and quote unquote including them into our organizations, if our organizations are steeped in a culture that is white supremacist, we're not really addressing the needs of anybody, right? When you're asking the questions like, oh, how can we hire Black people, or how can we make our marketing more friendly towards the LGBTQIA plus community, right? Like, if your inside culture is not a friendly place for people who come from marginalized backgrounds to be themselves, show up as much as they want to, and be celebrated for that, you're asking the wrong questions. And so what restorative justice does is asks us, one, of course, how can we repair the harm that our companies, our organizations have contributed to the people who work internally, our clients, our partners, et cetera, but also how are we proactively building that culture where people are having relationships that are rooted in equity and trust, right? And like that word equity is huge, right? You know, when we talk about D&I, you know, words like equity, belonging, justice often get thrown in. Equity is something to really push for. Like, how do we share power? How do we allow people who have not been historically, quote unquote, at the table and had their voices heard, have their voices elevated, and, you know, really considered and given decision-making power?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is really important to consider too, is just sharing the power, especially in organizations where you have managers, you have leaders, and then you have people who are just coming into this kind of microcosm of society as well. And you're trying to create equity, like you said. And also in our kind of previous conversation, we were talking about organizations who are ready for this conversation around restorative justice. What kinds of questions should leaders or people be asking themselves on an individual level to see if they are ready to engage with this work and really kind of move the needle forward?
Mm-hmm. I was part of a social justice accelerator program called Div Inc. And one of the questions that shout out Brooke, the program manager there, asked me was like, you know, people will ask, like, does restorative justice really work? And it was like, it's not a matter of if it works, it's a matter of like, will you do the work? Right? We're just talking about humans being in good relationship. And that takes an immense amount of work, right? Are you willing to do the hard work to interrogate the intersections of your identity and the impact of that, right? A lot of people with privilege don't do that. And when I say intersections of identity, I am not just talking about race, right? It's gender, sexuality, ability or disability, right? It is education, it is socioeconomic status, it is all these other different things that we don't necessarily consider. So thinking about how the impact of the way that we show up affects everybody that we're encountering, and identifying the ways that we've been socialized to believe those things. And if those things are causing harm, breaking those patterns, right? Are you willing to do the hard work to do that, right? That's fundamentally the question, right? Otherwise, we're just, you know, asking a nicer set of questions that are probably a little bit more compassionate, a little bit more respectful, and like still causing harm, right? Just dressed up a little bit better.
Absolutely. Are you willing to commit to doing the work long term? And also, that does not look like just having one anti-racism training at a corporation one time a year in response to like a world event or anything like that as well. And I think that's really important to highlight as well for folks who are really invested in kind of deconstructing these things in their minds as well, and also for their team. One of the elements, and I know you also mentioned this as well, in terms of restorative justice being like a tree, and the root value being respect and compassion. And in the workplace, we're talking about employees. How do you think that workplaces can really think about ensuring that employees' voices are truly heard and that we are building towards everyone having an equal seat at the table?
Yeah, when I think about those values, right? Those words mean different things to different people. And part of it is like having conversations intentionally with people that you're working with about like, what do these values mean to you, right? And how do you want to see them lived out, right? So there's no like blanket answer for this, right? Other than just like have the conversation with your people, and like don't just have the conversation performatively like, oh yeah, we had the conversation and now I'm going to like make whatever decision that I want, right? It's really taking the time to consider and listen. Like in a lot of ways, I think the question that you ask is like, just do it, you know, like
Yeah.
how do you make sure that everybody has equal voice and is heard? Like listen. Oh, ask, listen, and then do it, but, making sure that you have the feedback mechanisms in place to make sure that people are able to share. And I think, a lot of times people just say like, oh, let me know if you have any questions or whatever, right? But when there are power dynamics involved and people are just coming into the workplace to try to do their job, get paid, go home, right? They're not necessarily going to want to buy in and like give pushback if they think it's going to cause more trouble for them. So like as a manager, right, as a leader, how are you making sure that you're building a relationship with the people that you're working with where they feel safe enough to push back and like know that whatever they're going to be saying is like not going to be met with defensiveness. It's really going to be considered, heard, and potentially implemented.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. There's no silver bullet to that question, but definitely wanted to kind of know your thoughts and just being collaborative around that as well. And I think that goes to the level of trust that you collaboratively build with that person as well, and the level of accountability if you get negative feedback or you get constructive feedback, to and being open to working on that. One of the other elements that as I was reading about RJ was, a community agreement and what that looks like in practice. Could you give an example of like what a successful community agreement looks like through the lens of RJ?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just realized that there were 2 pages to this document. I was like, oh, are we done already? But we're on the next page. Yeah, community agreements look 2 different ways. One, like what are the proactive agreements that we are putting in place to make sure that we know like how we want to be together in space. And so like when you're reflecting on like values of respect, right? So does that mean, what does respect mean? Let's say in a meeting, right? Our community agreement for this meeting is your phone is going to be on silent. If you need to take a call, you're going to take it outside. And if you're going to be using your phone, you're going to be using it for work purposes, right? That's a community agreement that we can get behind, right? Proactively. After harm is caused, right? Community agreements can look like a lot of different things. And it depends on what is the need associated with the harm, right? I'll take it back to like something like relatively low stakes that is, I guess, pretty easy for people to understand, right? So when I was in 2nd grade, I was playing on the playground and I pushed my friend off the monkey bars, and she fell and broke her leg, right?
Yeah.
And so, part of the agreement that she and I and like our parents came to is like I was going to help her like with her carry her stuff
Yeah.
and like take with lunch, right? Because like of course like I didn't mean to break my friend's leg, but like the impact of my action caused that. And so how do we meet the needs that she has while she's at school? Like, oh, I can be responsible for that. And so like that was a community agreement that we put into place. Like the teacher knew about it, and parents knew about it. So like in the context of a workplace, right, when you're thinking about a harm that happens, someone uses a racial slur, right? We think about the needs that are brought up by that, both for the person who was called the racial slur, the person who said the racial slur, and the community as well, right? So we think about the impact first, right? It is not just that it hurt in the moment. It could be that it's brought up trauma, inflamed trauma, past experiences for that person, and that makes them not feel like they belong in this company context. They don't feel valued or understood. They have animosity towards this person now, right? They feel animosity towards the greater company because no one stood up for them in those moments, right? The
Right.
person who caused that harm, right? Let's imagine that they feel bad about it, right? They
Yeah.
probably feel scared
Right.
because they did something bad. They did something harmful, and they are afraid for their job. Maybe they're afraid of like what will happen to them as far as like social standing with their peers, and they are needing to like learn to speak a different way, right? Not use racial slurs. Maybe they unintentionally use the slur, like they weren't educated about what that meant. They need
Right.
to take accountability for their harm, change their behavior, maybe learn something different. The community, right, in that case, needs to step up and be like, hey, it's not on the person who was called the racial slur to educate that other person. Like, what are the things that we can do to step up, and what are the things that we can do to step up, both to educate and support the person who caused that harm, right, and hold them accountable to the extent that people can do that, and like, what are the things that we can do to support that person who's called the racial slur, to like let them know, like, hey, that's not okay, that's not what we stand for, these are the ways that we're going to support you moving forward, we're sorry we didn't support you in the moment when you needed it, right? And like the specific nuances of those things look different in every situation, but in general, like, we make those community agreements after harm happens based off of the needs. And so there's not like a playbook, but there are frameworks for addressing needs based off of like making agreements based on needs.
Absolutely. I think that was a really good example of just how you, one, hold accountability and space for people. And also, I appreciated your point about how it's not on the person, for in this example, who is called the racial slur, to speak up, and all of the emotional labor and trauma is on them. And you're really focusing on, in this conversation and collaborativeness also, is what resources can we provide to this person, and also just people in general as they enter into our community as well, to make sure that this doesn't happen again, or to make sure that you are, again, having a two-way conversation as well. I do have another question that is related to going back to just when you go into these organizations or schools as well, do you internally measure the effectiveness of your workshops, or does it go back to your earlier point of what you were talking about in terms of really getting people to do the internal work with a capital W?
Yeah. Oh, work with a capital W. I like it.
Okay.
For myself, I measure my impact by the feedback that individuals give me, right, about the way that they've been able to apply this work. I think like there is an inherent contradiction between restorative justice and capitalist and capitalism,
Yeah.
right? And so when we're bringing these practices into organizations, or schools or organizations, right, they produce students, right, like they
Yeah.
produce working members of society, right, there are some inherent contradictions, specifically around time and policy, and those things can be worked to change. But like, I think at the end of the day, we're really just relying on the relationships that people have to navigate, right? Policy is only as good as the people who are upholding them. And so like, if we're giving people this toolkit, this way of being, this lens to navigate the world and navigate the relationships of the people that they're working with, that's what's going to make the difference, right? How are your teams able to deal with conflict? How are you proactively avoiding conflict by like having conversations about collaborative agreements? How are you building relationships and checking in to make sure both that you are the proactive agreements that you have in place are meeting everybody's needs, but also like just building relationship for the sake of building relationship. So you're able to identify needs before they become a crisis, right? And able to meet those needs before like they become more harmful, right? It's those things, right? It's people having common language to discuss issues around inequity and oppression, right? And how to build from that, how to build collaboratively from that. It's those things that are a little bit harder to measure, but definitely have impact through the relationships people have.
Absolutely. Are you seeing a difference in the kinds of feedback that you're getting from individuals from when you first started to now, or what people are saying or asking, or the level of kind of information that they're looking for?
Interesting. I don't think that there is a huge difference. I think what I love to hear the most is that like, oh my gosh, like I've always thought about this, but I haven't had language to like conceptualize it. Like restorative justice is a framework that like really gets to this idea of relationships and interconnection that, I believe like all humans crave, right? We want to be in good relationship with each other. And we put up walls for ourselves when we go into places that are, we don't deem conducive to us being safe in relationship to prevent ourselves from getting hurt, right? And the only way to break down those walls is to be intentional about being vulnerable and creating spaces for people to be vulnerable, to both learn and grow together. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Do you think that managers and just leaders have a different responsibility than other kind of team members to build that sense of vulnerability and just like empowering them to speak up because there is a different relationship because of the structure of the way it's set up, if that makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like I experienced that myself, right? I am it's weird to say like I'm just over a year into Amplify RJ itself being a business. I've been doing this work for, the past 6 or 7, but as I'm doing this work and working with people, I don't have employees per se, but I have people who do work for me in exchange for money, like on a contractor basis, right?
Yep.
Like no one else is a W-2, right? But the relationships that I have with them are what really allows this work to grow and thrive. And I think one of the things that I'll shout out Omi, one of the people who worked with me, really brought to me is like, I am a lot more motivated to do this work when like you demonstrate to me like one that like I am valued and appreciated. And like one of the ways that I get that is like there's reciprocal like vulnerability. Like we're not just checking in about like the project. You're telling me about like, and it can be simple things like, I was so frustrated because like they ran out of the cereal that I really like at the grocery store. And I was like really bummed about that. And it can be like more life things too, right? Like it can be like, oh my gosh, I was freaked out about like going to this wedding, but like I enjoyed it. Fingers crossed that like everybody is safe coming out of it. But how are you modeling for your people that like it's okay to be vulnerable in those spaces? It's okay to come with questions. It's okay to come with issues, right? If people don't trust that you can hold that space for them, they won't do it. And so there's an enormous, and I'm not removing responsibility from people who are reporting to leaders and managers.
Right, absolutely.
They actively have to participate in that, but it's riskier for them, right? And so people in leadership do have to model it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that goes back to your earlier point as well when you mentioned like at the end of an email or at the end of the conversation, like just let me know if you have any questions, like, but assuming that nobody's going to say that. Or when you say, okay, like, how are you? And everyone's like, okay, we're good. Like, let's get started with the meeting. It's just like authentically asking and intentionally listening for the response instead of thinking about what you're going to say.
Right.
Next.
It's not just asking for the sake of asking. It's like someone responded. What are you going to do with that response? Right. I think um, in the simple classroom example, just because it comes to mind, right? You have a student who says like, you check in with the classroom at the beginning of the day and like, hey, I'm hungry. It's like, what are you going to do? Like, all right, well, lunch is in 3 hours. Good luck. No,
Yeah.
you're going to try to figure out how to feed the kid, right? So they can like best do their job, right? When people are giving you feedback about things that they need or how they are, like you've got to be responsive to those things.
Absolutely. It's not just asking and then being like, okay, well, I'm sorry you're feeling bad today, or I'm sorry that you are. Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree with that as well.
I would say, and it's not even that like people, you have to have the solution for it, but like you have to take that into consideration, right? People need to be like really heard.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Are there ways that if people are listening and they want to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
Everything would be on amplifyrj.com. Of course, I'm on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, amplifyrj@gmail.com. This is airing in May, right? Mid-May.
Yes.
Yeah, so later this month, there will be an open workshop for people who are wanting to learn more about restorative justice in the workplace. I don't have a solid date for that yet, but check the website and it'll be there for you.
Amazing. Is there anything else that you want to share with folks who are listening, who are interested in learning more about restorative justice or something that we haven't discussed here today? I always like to ask.
Oh man, there's so much that we didn't discuss today. I think one of the things I think about how there is there's a reawakened need for well, there's a reawakened interest for diversity, equity, inclusion, or justice work. And I know that that need is not always that need is always going to be there, but the sense of urgency around it isn't always there. And I invite people to act proactively learn these things instead of trying to scramble and respond. It's always okay to be looking for answers when there's situations that need addressing, right? But what's the old adage, like an ounce of prevention is worth more than a ton of the cure, right? Like
I have never heard that.
oh, well, so like, like you can do so little work on the front end to prevent like so much more harm. And it's so much more work to repair harm than it is to do things proactively. So if you're interested in learning about restorative justice, or like really diving deep into what it means to be anti-racist, I'm not just saying come to Amplify RJ. I'm saying like do that work up front, because the world is not getting wider and more homogenous. It's getting more diverse, right? There are more people coming into organizations in the workforce that are coming from all different kinds of backgrounds and are more empowered to stand in, who they are in all the intersections of their identity. And the workplace needs to be responsive to that. I think restorative justice is a good framework as a baseline for people to be working from, but there are lots of different ways that y'all can be proactively doing this work, because change is coming. And in the words of Octavia Butler, in one of the Earthseed verses from, Earthseed, the Books of the Living, change or die.
Yep, there we go. Yeah. I definitely think that is really important. Also, obviously not the same, but it just makes me think of when people are thinking about their mental health as well. And they're just like, I'm just going to go to therapy when I have a really big problem or when I'm struggling with something. And that's more of a reactive approach. But if you're doing that kind of work ahead of time as well, and you are practicing those strategies and frameworks, it's just you have those tools in your toolkit as well. So I definitely think that's true.
Yeah, no, how do we make mental health care a part of comprehensive healthcare reform and all that? But that's a whole nother conversation.
Oh, of course, we could have a whole nother episode about that. But thank you so much, David, for taking the time to speak with us today. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for the work that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. At AllVoices, we believe in the empowerment of all employees to speak up and think it's a requirement in order for everyone to succeed at the organization. David, we'll talk soon.